Hi, I'm Brad Littlejohn, and I'm here talking with Alistair Roberts today about how Christians should engage social media. We've done a number of conversations this week here in our community reflecting on what is social media, what is this new context in which we find ourselves, and how can Christians navigate it thoughtfully. Now, one of the things we sort of started with was thinking about the metaphor of technology as a tool. This is often brought up as a way of saying technology is just a neutral tool. We can use it for good or evil, and so Christians just need to make sure you have good people, Christians using it for good reasons, and then that we don't need to worry about it. But there's two problems with this, at least. One is that any tool, that's a naive way to think of any tool. Tools are not neutral in the sense they can just be used for whatever. A tool is designed for a particular purpose. It's good at doing some things, it's bad at doing other things. And if we rely exclusively on one tool, our patterns of behavior will be changed to do the kinds of things that tool makes easier and to do less of the kinds of things that are harder to do with that tool. So if we're going to think thoughtfully about, if we're going to be wise in our use of tools, we need to know what sorts of things they are driving us towards, what sorts of things they're driving us away from. Of course, and the other issue is that, so even with any tool, there's a sense in which we are not just acting, but we're being acted upon. But I think it's sort of especially true when we're thinking of something like social media. It's a medium that we find ourselves immersed in. And quite frequently, we are not the agents taking hold of a passive tool and using it to some objective. Rather, we are the passive tool being acted upon. And not just in the cynical kind of, Facebook's using us to mine us for data to sell to advertisers. That may be true. But just even the social network part of it shapes us, I think, in ways that we are often naive about. And if we want to, that doesn't mean we have to be scared of it, but it does mean if we're going to use it well, we have to know what it is we're dealing with.
Yes, I think there are a number of aspects of this that we can develop. For instance, the fact on social media, we're not just agents using it as a tool, but we are agents who are representing ourselves within this realm. And so who we are is a construction of images, of words, of associations, and things like that, and it frames who we are. And so the agent is not just someone who's, as it were, behind acting with this neutral tool, but the agent is constituted in various ways by the tool. Who we are is something that is defined in terms of the boxes, as it were, that something like Facebook gives us to present ourselves within. And so that's one aspect of it that is quite different from using, for instance, a hammer or some more traditional form of tool. The other thing is that when a tool or technology becomes big enough, it can become something that structures a world.
Right.
Something
like
that...
the automobile.
Indeed.
Yeah.
The automobile is a good example. So the way that our towns are designed is something that has resulted in large part from ordering our lives around this particular technology. There are great opportunities that it affords to us. But there are also ways in which it has framed our reality in a way that's more than just individual choice, that we increasingly operate within a world established by the technology. And that, I think, is a step beyond what we'd usually mean when we talk about a tool. A tool is something that is generally operating beneath our agency, rather than something that structures our agency itself.
And the car is a good example of something that we're obviously not trying to go back to a pre-automobile world. There's all kinds of new frontiers, literally, that have been opened up to us by that. So there's tremendous benefits to human society in many levels. But there's also many drawbacks. And to some extent, some of these drawbacks, things that we can't have without having the benefits. And so we have to kind of do a cost-benefit analysis, or we're stuck with it for good or ill.
Yep.
Some of them are things that we can plan our lives, plan our cities in such a way to sort of mitigate against the negative effects while still having some of the positive effects. I think that's what part we want to think about with social media too.
So with the car, we can often think about there are a number of things that render the car less efficient. For instance, in city design, having pedestrianised areas, having a city that is very compact. It means you can't really park places. You have to walk a lot more, these sorts of things. And it renders things less convenient for the car and for drivers. But on the other hand, it can be more effective for community. And so weighing costs and benefits and thinking prudentially about what is best to make the most of the possibilities opened up to us by the technology, while also guarding against some of its risks.
And I think it's also actually a very good metaphor, because one of the things that the car does is enables us to have a wider community, to connect with people that we wouldn't otherwise be able to connect with, to see your aunt on the other side of the country, every year rather than a couple of times in a lifetime. So it broadens our social sphere immensely, but at the risk of making it shallower and thinner and pulling us away, because of the very convenience of getting out and seeing other people. We aren't forced to do the hard work of relating to the people close to us, and that's exactly
good example
what
of
social media
churches.
is doing too. Yeah,
Churches where the church you attend when you have a car is less determined by your locality and the people that you're actually living with, and as a result, if you don't get on with the people in your neighbourhood, you can worship with people in the neighbourhood 30 miles away. There's less of the gravitational pull to a particular location. And also it means that some of the disciplines that we would have to learn when we have to get on with the people that are near to us, and we can't just escape our contexts, those disciplines are not naturally forced upon us. And as a result, what was once imposed upon us by necessity has to be taken up as a sort of self-discipline.
Yeah, it strikes me. The church analogy I think is good, because that we think about the way social media has enabled Christians to. One of the positives is we're less stuck within particular hidebound communities where all the Christians we know only do things one way and only believe one thing, and everyone else is sort of very either not known about it at all or is suspect. Now we have an opportunity to engage with a much broader swath of the church and recognize the universality of the church in a way that can be healthy, and yet at the same time we're pulled. Our loyalty to our local church is attenuated. Often we find we sort of have an alternative digital communion of saints that we prefer hanging out with, and perhaps sometimes for legitimately good reasons, and yet if we don't learn the discipline of relating to people who may be less comfortable to hang out with, may resonate less with our particular interests. If we don't learn that discipline, we're not learning the virtues of actually living in community. We're just constructing a community that suits our preferences. Which is in the same thing that I think churches have done in the. Actually, sorry, it strikes me what I just said about being in a hidebound church where everyone's like you. That is the result of the automobiles. We went from, you had a naturally diverse community, because people of all sorts were just thrust together in a geographical location, to you had churches that were sorting out based on ideological preferences because of the automobile, and now social media can enable us a way of encountering a new diversity again. But also of just sorting ourselves out according to different criteria.
I think there are a number of things that even the fact of separating out into different denominations allows for a diversity that you couldn't sustain in a single community. Mm-hmm. In a single community, you have to learn how to, you're knocking into each other, and eventually you will have far more, you will have a tendency to become more like each other. And you'll have to work it out with people who are different from you. Whereas when you do have a plurality of denominations, often it can allow for a greater diversity, for ideas to become more differentiated, and then to bring those into conversation in a more aerated way, where they would not just squeeze each other out, and there is space for different positions to exist. So that can be, in some senses, a healthy development. I wouldn't want to reject everything that denominations represent. On the other hand, the internet can often be a sort of zero gravity community
Mm-hmm.
where there's not the same pull to actually engage with certain people that are close to us. And also, the danger often is, people talk about echo chambers, but often the danger is that we're thrust into interaction with people who are very different from us, that we react against, and we feel emotionally exposed to them. And as a result of that sense of emotional exposure, we react against them, and we become more polarized, more antagonistic, more defined by our oppositions. Mm-hmm. Whereas if you're in a particular community and you're not really encountering people with significantly other viewpoints, you'll argue about the carpet in the church, but you won't really be arguing about the same sort of things that we're arguing about today, which are far more ideological and political. And these polarizations that we have, I think, owe a lot to the sort of media that we're engaging on.
So there's a number of different aspects that we've talked about this week, kind of key features of the new social media context. And one of these that you've talked about is the idea of the constructed self, right? To some extent, whenever we go out in public, we are attempting to construct something of a persona that the way we want to appear to the outside world, and, dressing in appropriate ways, dressing ourselves well, showing good manners that we, whereas at home we might lounge around in our sweatpants. So we're constructing a socialized self, but there's a way in which this happens on a Facebook profile or a Twitter feed or a blog that I think takes that to a different level that can be potentially quite unhealthy.
Yes. Most of our identities as we experience them within day-to-day life are largely given. I mean, I'm physically here next to you and we're having this conversation within a context and a setting where we know each other, we have a background and a history, we have a sense of each other's contexts, mutual friends, things like that, and families, these sorts of things. And we're rooted within that context, and a lot of who we are is seen as a given thing. And so, as I'm speaking to you here, the things that I'm saying are contextualized by what you know about me, and the sort of context I'm coming from, the beliefs that we share in common. Whereas on the internet, we are detached individuals for the most part. You don't really see community online. You don't see things like generations online. You see people of many different ages, but the age doesn't really function in that way. That would in personal conversation and interaction. You don't see family online. You can have family relationships on Facebook and that sort of thing, but it's not the same sort of prominence that you see within a regular context. Other things you don't see online. You don't see a church online as a unified entity. You don't see what it means to live in a particular neighborhood. You don't see poverty or disability online. Mm-hmm. And for all these reasons, we are expressing who we are within a particular context that's provided to us. So Facebook gives you almost a cookie-cutter way of presenting yourself, and you attach certain labels or affiliations to yourself, and that helps you to define, this is who I am in relationship to other people. And it's worth bearing in mind that one of the reasons why that is the case is because you need to be rendered scrutable for advertisers, for data analysis and other things like that.
Right.
It's for their sake that it's not necessary. There is something obscure and particular about our actual identities that can't easily be rendered in terms of a universal cookie-cutter pattern.
No.
So,
well, I mean, push back, you talk about disability can't be seen online, poverty can't be seen online, and in many ways, those features can because of prejudice, become barriers to actually encountering who someone really is. Right? Yeah. Someone can't actually express who they actually are, can't speak and be heard because they have some. Maybe they're just extremely socially awkward and have a really hard time actually communicating. And so the online environment, it's not a more artificial self. They can actually communicate more authentically and be listened to and heard and known in a way that they might not be able to because of the barriers of face-to-face interaction.
I think that's definitely true in many cases. I think many of us have also had the experience of interacting with people who we may not have had direct interaction with before, or opportunities for direct interaction. We may have been at early stages of our education, whereas they were professors or authority figures, pastors, others like that. But we could have a more a conversation with them that we were acting more as peers. Now, there are definitely benefits to that, and I think many people have found the internet to be liberating for that reason. On the other hand, one of the dangers, I think, in these sorts of conversations, particularly as they go beyond the earlier stage of the internet and the forms that was marked by maybe email discussion lists, forums, things like blogs in the earlier stages, and more to the age of Facebook, Twitter, Snapchat, Instagram, YouTube, these sorts of things, there is a shift to a different sort of interaction. One of the things that I think takes place is the identity of ourselves becomes far more a part of the conversation. So whereas in the past, if we were having a conversation, it was very much like going to the frontier, and you meet weird and bizarre people out there, but you can interact and learn things and have spar with other people, and it's fun. But they don't know who you are, and you don't know them from Adam.
Yep.
And there's a context there that's primarily about working through ideas and common interests. And then at certain points, you can have forums where people do know each other, and there are networks of actual personal connection behind many of the online networks. But those are very specific contexts that are not just general contexts open to all comers.
Right.
What I think we have today is this danger that we are constantly self-branding. On the internet and social media, I am what I say. I am also the images that are attached to me, and the labels and the affiliations and things like that. Whereas in personal interaction, there's a lot of given reality about me that means that the things that I say are seen against that background and are not so defining for who I am. On social media, since we are constantly engaging in self-branding, people feel a lot more invested and threatened by assaults to their ideas, because their ideas are far more integral to their identity and the projection of who they are that they're putting forward.
Yeah, makes sense. Now, going back just a couple minutes ago, you talked about the kind of, the democratizing impulse of the internet. This is, again, something that's very valuable in as much as you said, a sort of junior scholar might have way more opportunity to actually engage with a more senior scholar or a wider range of authorities in different subjects than he would otherwise feel comfortable doing within the past social hierarchies. You have marginalized groups and voices and viewpoints that really do have something to offer to the church that didn't have a platform for before, and now they do. And that's enriching to our discourse in many ways. And yet, to have a meaningful discourse, you have to have a meaningful community discourse. And community requires a relationship of some authority, some teachers and learners, some idea of a common good around which we're all pursuing, and otherwise you just have a crowd. You have a cacophony of voices in which truth. There's no order to the search for truth because there are no authorized guides in the search.
Yes, here one of the difficulties, the real challenges that we face, is traditionally public speech was done by representatives of a community or by key figures who had gone through processes of editing or things like getting credentials or attaining office in order to have a public voice. And public voice was authorized, it was official, it was the most amplified and broadcasted voice as well. It was the voice that represented the common good of a community. It represented something that was more than just a personal opinion. What we have on social media in many respects is a situation where the most amplified and broadcasted voices are not necessarily official, authorized, or representing the good of any particular community. They're voices that are amplified as personal opinions within no man's land. Whereas the public is an actual body of people. When you have public speeches representing or acting within the context of a specific body of people, that is not the case online. So public speech is increasingly being detached from highly broadcast and amplified and open speech.
I mean, the important point there is this democratization does not result in an actual level playing field. There's never an actual level playing field. There are always more authoritative and less authoritative voices. There's the person on Twitter who has 100,000 followers, the person who has 100 followers, and what we might like to think that that's because we sort of have a pure meritocracy. The person who has 100,000 followers does because their tweets are 1,000 times higher in quality. But of course we know that's not the case, right? There are all kinds of factors, some reasonable, some quite unreasonable, some deeply unhealthy, that lead to certain people being given larger platforms and de facto voices of authority within this new milieu that often have, and these factors, it is true that the previous processes of vetting and that would determine whether someone was qualified to speak representatively, there might have been arbitrariness there sometimes, in which legitimate voices were sidelined for illegitimate reasons. But there were also lots of very reasonable considerations and very reasonable quality controls. And what we have now is a much greater degree of arbitrariness in terms of which voices are given prominence and which ones are functionally marginalized.
And what you were mentioning earlier about the significance of the crowd, I think needs to be attended to here, that instead of the public and ordered speech within the life of the public that is representing and seeking the good of the public, what we have now are crowd dynamics, which are very much about just individuals within the mass, and the mass takes the place of the public. And within that context of the mass, I think you see ideas tend to move in a different way. So virality and things like that tend to take over from more authoritative speech. And
we think of that as empowering, but it's not actually. There are very few people who are actually feel like they are agents directing the course of conversation. People feel like they are caught up in a flood and being pulled along in a conversation that they may not have intended to happen the way it happened.
And the way that we tend to act within a crowd that's undifferentiated and unstructured, we can easily stampede almost. There's a sort of avalanching of public opinion that does not operate according to consideration and deliberation and reflection and then response. We just have something hit us, and then we have an emotional impression and an emotional reaction. And as a result, we are actually diminished in the degree to which we are agents of conversation. We are people who are caught up within this dynamic of crowd discourse. And that can be very difficult, I think, to arrest when we find ourselves within a high-speed environment, for instance. It's very difficult to slow down and to take the time that we need to come to a wise judgment. Also, when we're so surrounded by people and in a socially saturated realm, it's very difficult to give ourselves the space, the solitude, the time, and the emotional space within which to come to our own judgment, not just to echo the judgments of others around us.
So there's two concepts you just mentioned that I think are worth exploring further. One is this idea of social saturation, the idea that our conversations are taking place in a context in which any barrier between public and private has been broken down. This is not just a function of the internet per se, but the way that we experience the internet now. As you mentioned, something like Facebook is a very different conversational environment than blogs of 15 years ago, in which you could enter into a conversation and then retreat from it. And now now, as you say, it's sort of come into your living room, and particularly with smartphones and the fact that we just have difficulty actually unplugging at any point from the conversation. We're constantly in a socially saturated environment, and I think that doesn't give us the space to reflect and form wise judgments about issues.
Yes.
And similarly, the issue of speed, just the speed at which communications happen, is similarly harmful to our ability to think critically and articulate ourselves carefully.
Yes, when we have a conversation more generally, we're very much affected by the context within which it takes place. So, for instance, we're having this conversation here in a more private environment. People will be seeing it online, but there is a context of friendship and a relaxed environment where we're sharing the same physical room and we're interacting on that basis. If we're in a context where there are hundreds of people milling around us, some people interjecting into the conversation and cheerleading for either side and arguing, and that sense of hostile eavesdroppers as well, it would change the dynamics of the way we're going about things. Same with...
And of course, the irony is that we are about to
post
this in an environment where people can do that,
but for
as long
instance,
as there's no unlike button, we're okay.
if you think about the way that people interact in a debating chamber, there is an argument that takes place, but then at the end they'll shake hands and maybe share a drink in the bar, but there's a particular arena of discourse that enables challenging discourse to take place in a way that's contextualized by a broader commonality, like the playing field as well, the way that we can have competitions and challenge and agonism, but yet that's not something that defines the whole of our lives. Likewise, with the experience of going out and having a conversation in a coffee shop, that's a different sort of thing from the experience of inviting someone into a very intimate setting. So if you invite someone into your front room and you have a meal with them in a more private setting, there are certain issues that are more threatening within that context. If you discussed it out with them on the street, it wouldn't be threatening in the same way. So we need to pay attention to that sort of thing. One of the things that you see within more traditional modes of public discourse is that they've gone to a lot of effort to structure discourse to ensure that it does not become overheated, that it does not collapse into one undifferentiated shouting match. So, for instance, if you think about conversations in the House of Commons in the UK, you address not the person you're talking, challenging, you address the speaker. And then you address the speaker in a way that represents the other party that you're arguing with as honourable. The right honourable gentleman says such and such. That means that their honour is not in dispute. It means that you are not directly challenging them. So there is this sense of a commonality that you have. You're both honourable people and you're arguing about this issue. You're not arguing about it face to face with them in a way that might easily become amplified and more antagonistic, but you're talking to a more dispassionate third party who mediates your dispute. Likewise, in the court, if we're going to achieve justice in society, we do that through a highly choreographed series of conversations which are related together, and as they are related together well, we have justice as a result of that. So the conversations in the jury room, or the conversations between the advocates and the people they represent, or between the judge and the advocates, or between court reporters and the general public. All of these conversations must take place alongside each other for justice to be done well and publicly. But yet, if we were all to have that conversation together, it wouldn't work well. Now, on the internet, that's a lot of what is taking place.
Now, do you think there's an extent to which what you're talking about here, you might say, is privileging a kind of particularly masculine ideal of how discourse should take place, and that kind of aspiration to separate out the person from the idea and be able to have a kind of dispassionate deliberation without it being about you personally? That's something that men are more likely to do than women, and I think partly that is one of the particular challenges of social media, is that we have a space in which the gender dynamics are all being thrown into there in an undifferentiated way, and there are might have modes of talking that work well between men, work well between women, and there are other modes of talking that work well between the sexes. But those different modes are not being respected; they're just kind of clashing.
Yes, I think that's definitely something that we're seeing on social media. Some person has remarked a while back that social media can often feel like the bad boys against the mean girls. A lot of our social and political dynamics now have that sort of character to it, where these highly gendered dynamics end up in collision with each other. Even online, I think you see that there are certain forms of discourse that are highly gendered. So if you go to the comments on any news site, those are 80% male.
Right.
Likewise, something like Wikipedia is 90% male. Other things like fan fiction is 80% female. And there are different dynamics even on the same medium, something like a blog. Female blogs and male blogs tend to have different dynamics. And I think a lot of these things do rise from natural differences in the way that we discourse. When we're talking about some of the forms of discourse that I've been mentioning, things like the law court or the arguments of a political chamber, there is a more masculine dynamic to that. And I think it's an important form of discourse to preserve for a healthy society where ideas are challenged, where they're held up for scrutiny, and it's not just these ideas are detached from the person in order that they might be challenged. And we expect our leaders to be those who are subject to challenge. So if you're going to be a leader of a country, for instance, you are expected to be able to act as a combatant, someone who's able to argue and be argued against without being seen as that being a personal attack.
Right.
And so that's an important part of our discourse that can easily break down within certain contexts online. I think what we need to recognise is that that is not the only form of discourse. And if that's the only form of discourse, which it can become within certain hypermasculine contexts where you're constantly having these arguments, you end up losing a lot. I think one of the things that struck me in the debates about a year and a half ago around the subject of the Trinity was there were two different ways of approaching that conversation. When the questions about the eternal subordination of the Son. For the men in the conversation, for the most part, it tended to be seen as a theological debate of more objective, abstract theological doctrine. And there are important issues at stake there. But for most of the women in the debate, it was far more rooted to very specific local personal concerns. And it was more subjective, but not in a way that was... There were appropriate concerns there.
So can you give me an example?
So for instance, it was the concern that this vision of the Trinity was being used to undergird a particular vision of the relationship between men and women, a relationship in which authority was the dominant category. Now, if you're thinking purely in terms of abstract Trinitarian doctrine, you may have issues with that. I think both of us have issues with the way that the Trinity functioned within that debate. But our concerns were less rooted within the contextual issues of how these play out. Now, when those two different sets of concerns came into interaction, the result was often very messy and confused and unhelpful. But those two sets of concerns are both important and both need to be addressed. And I think online we choreograph this very poorly, but increasingly one of the things that we're seeing online is that there are sets of concerns that women bring to the conversation that have not been well dealt with in traditional forms of theological conversation within the church more generally. The sorts of communities that are forming online for women, I think, reveal that the authority structures that are typical within the church are ones that often marginalise or neglect women's concerns. And so communities of women forming online around charismatic and female leaders or figures that are what I've described as super peers in many cases, someone who's a few years older than you, who represents the sort of person you'd like to be. So rather than a traditional authority figure, someone who's maybe a generation or more older than you, and who can speak with a more commanding voice into your situation. Now you have these super peer figures, and people are very much looking for mentorship and connection with these sorts of figures. And we see this, I think, for younger generations on YouTube and Twitter and places like that, where certain young, charismatic figures hold a lot of influence, whether that's Logan Paul or PewDiePie or these sorts of characters on YouTube, or whether it's someone like Rachel Held Evans. And these are the figures that I think are increasingly shaping people's understanding of themselves, who they want to be, what they believe, their values, and understanding the way that the natural dynamics of discourse and the differences between men and women, for instance, play into this, I think, is important. Because at the moment we have a lot of colliding interests and ways in which we're being brought into deeper antagonisms rather than actually taking each other's concerns seriously and producing conversations where we produce distinct conversations, healthy conversations between the conversations, and we have ways in which everyone is on it, where their interests aren't abandoned simply because they don't conform to a particular mode of discourse. And the internet pushes us to take these things seriously in ways that we haven't before.
Yeah, I think one of the big challenges to having ordered conversations that we sort of would aspire toward is the way in which the social media pushes towards decontextualization, right? And on one level is simply the ability of words to be taken out of context, and it's so easy to copy and paste something and tweet it and make it look objectionable. I mean, one good thing about this video is it's hard to do that, though. If one of us said something really obnoxious, it's actually very easy for someone to, I don't want to give anyone ideas, but take a little clip and then make that clip go viral. So anything can be cut and pasted and twisted, but even where there's not a sort of malevolent attempt to distort, the way in which, as you say, things go viral and the original context in which something is spoken is quickly lost. Even in cases when someone is reading the whole thing. So if you think about if someone shares a post on Facebook, if I go and read that entire post through and I don't just read some little snippet, still my reading of that is not usually informed by my knowledge of the blogger, my knowledge of where he's coming from, and even taking this one article on its own terms. My approach to it is sort of like, well, this person shared it, and I kind of know what I think of this person, and they made these little remarks about it when they shared it, and there are these comments on their thread,
and certain people are liking
it, and so my whole reading of it is informed by this new context in which the ideas have been transported into. Even in cases when I am being patient enough to read through the entire article someone's written, which is, for most of us, the exception rather than the rule.
And we're very much, even before you've read that article, because it's been shared on Facebook or Twitter, you've already been primed to respond to it in a particular way by the person who shared it, and also by your sense of their values, their party, whatever it is. I often feel, for instance, when I'm blogging, it's like speaking into a mic with someone else fiddling with the volume control, because the things that people hear of what I say are primarily the more controversial posts. Right. If I write something on the subject of scripture and some biblical theology, a few people will share it.
And that's the point. The more tense or controversial or high stakes something is, the more likely it is to suffer from that decontextualization.
And thinking back on when I first started blogging was, in that particular context, it was a group of maybe about 20 or 30 bloggers who all interacted with each other, broadly knew each other, and there were certain conversation topics that they were all talking about. Mm-hmm. And so it was an aerated conversation. And then within that conversation, people would be following blogs on a regular basis. So generally you'd use an RSS feed, something like Google Reader, or and more recently things like Feedly and other things like that. And so you'd be reading every single thing that blogger put out, and you'd have a sense of where they were coming from, the things that really concerned them, the larger structure of their thought. And then when you read a particular individual post, it would be framed by all of that. Whereas if you read a post that's just been linked on Facebook, it's a very different dynamic. It's a dynamic that is shaped by those social dynamics and polarizations and oppositions. It's framed by more detached information in many cases, a particular quote or something that's taken. And it's also something that's framed by a far more open context. Whereas in the past, these things were obscure conversations. I mean, if I said something daft, and there were plenty of daft things I said back in the day, it wouldn't be broadcast all over the internet. People would find it very hard to... People just would not have access to it. Search engines and social media and all these sorts of things weren't at the level to bring these things to a broad audience, a general audience that they are now.
One thing that strikes me is the way in which these things are then put in a new context, the context of the feed, right? So the Facebook feed, right? So it's not one particular person's feed. I'm scrolling down and I'm seeing a whole bunch of things that people have been posting about. So what tends to happen is when there's something controversial going on, something that's sort of working up a lot of people, I might see lots of different people sharing lots of different things about a particular issue, which can create... what can happen there is I get the sense of, man, there's just people in general are so worked up about this in this irrational way. I kind of, sort of blur it all together because there are thoughtful people weighing in a very thoughtful way about something, and there are other people who are just like getting really worked up in a very irrational way. And the way it's all sort of thrown together in the mishmash of the Facebook feed is it just becomes people in general are getting worked up in general, and the particular concerns that they're voicing are not part of it. And it's interesting, I saw this in the way that some of the reactions, I think, to Rod Dreher's Benedict option, and the way that there were people who were clearly they were ostensibly reacting to either particular things that Dreher said or particular reviews of Dreher. But they weren't actually reacting to the claims and arguments being articulated in those essays. They were reacting to what they saw as a particular or a general frenzy about this topic. And so they were casting stones at what they saw as an unhealthy, outrage or unhealthy, alarmism or whatever, an unhealthy retreatism in a way that then I was like, for me who hadn't actually been paying attention to a lot of the Twitter conversation around the Benedict option, when I would go and read these things, read these reviews, and read the actual book itself, there seemed to be this disconnect. Like, what are they reacting to? And I realize now they were reacting to this new context in which these words have been put.
And often reacting to the reaction.
Yeah, exactly.
I think on that particular front, you see the dynamics of the conversation are very different to what they would have been in the past, where you read the material in a private context, in solitude, you arrive at a judgment and you respond to it. And then you see there are other people who have particular viewpoints. But those viewpoints are held very much distinct from each other. They're less crowded together in a way that becomes viral and contagious. And so you arrive at your judgment, someone else arrives at another judgment, and those may coincide or there may be differences, but there isn't the same collective judgment.
Right.
And I think that's something new. Also, the very speed of the conversation. People are talking about this. What do you think? You must position yourself. You must brand yourself relative to this issue.
But there's so much peer pressure too, right? I mean, it's the number of times I've had
you haven't said something. Don't you care?
Right. Well, there's that, and I've had the experience of like seeing a movie and forming a judgment about it, and then you see everyone else's response, you see all the other reviews, and it's interesting to see how then there may have been this diversity of takes in the movie, and then people gravitate toward, I'm supposed to. The smart people are saying this about the movie, so that's what I'm supposed to do too. And it was interesting to see this with The Force Awakens, where there might have been this initial enthusiasm, and then there kind of coalesced this new consensus that it was actually, kind of just second-rate, nostalgic copycat thing, where everyone's judgments were being formed by everyone else's judgments, and and of course that dynamic happens and has happened in traditional media. But the speed at which we sort of attune ourselves to the what's supposed to be the collective opinion is.
And that example of something like The Force Awakens, I think, is good in getting us into the issue of the spectacle.
Right.
That we've always, over the past century or so, our lives have been increasingly framed by the spectacle of something like TV or something like the movies, and our consumption of that can often become something in which we find ourselves, and we define our identities very much in relationship to this great spectacle, often in opposition to life directly lived. Now, what social media adds, I think, is a secondary spectacle alongside that, where we become part of the spectacle ourselves, where we are constantly exposed to the gaze of others, and we feel ourselves exposed to the gaze of others. And also, in our consumption of those sorts of movies and things like that, we're constantly alert to the ways in which we position ourselves relative to that. And so people have talked about social media as a second screen.
Mm.
So when you're watching a particular TV series, you're sharing your thoughts about it on Twitter, and people are reacting to that, and gradually judgments are formed about this thing on the primary screen, and that's not something that we'd have to the same degree in the past. What we have also, as we are drawn into the spectacles, we become part of the spectacle ourselves. We relate to ourselves differently. That spectacle starts to mediate our sense of who we are. I've described it as akin to bringing some cases where a mirror has been brought to a society where people have never seen their faces in a mirror before, where they haven't had clear water to see their reflection in, but as a result, they see their faces for the first time, and it's a traumatic experience. I mean, every morning, we see ourselves, and it may be a traumatic experience, but there's this experience of mediating our sense of self. We don't really notice that we're doing it, but it is mediating our sense of self by our image, and thinking that this is how other people are going to see me as I go forth on the day. I need to be very careful of how I present myself, this sort of thing. Social media is a representation that we have created of ourselves, a particular image that we are cultivating, branding in many respects. And that can become constitutive of our identity, something that defines who we think we are, how we relate to ourselves. If I've not shared my holiday pics on Facebook, have I truly had that holiday? We become very invested in that representation of ourselves. And it's worth thinking about how that changes the way that we relate to a lot of different things, like the ideas that we share, when that becomes an aspect of personal branding, not just an idea that's thrown out there that we can argue about, with my identity being far more rooted in the givenness of my context and relationships.
Yeah. So I think we're going to have to wrap this up, but I mean, the basic takeaway, if there is one basic takeaway, is the only way in which we're going to navigate these new contexts well and prudently and virtuously is if we're really self-conscious about the ways in which they are shaping us, the way in which we may be thinking that we are forming real judgments about the world and thinking that we are actually articulating our own viewpoints, and need to be self-critical about the extent to which we are actually being shaped by these new contexts to articulate ideas that might not actually be our own, and might be and feeling pulled. One of the I think key things to recognize is the way in which this medium can warp our sense of what's important.
Yep.
And that's why it's valuable discipline to take if Facebook is if you're regular on Facebook, take a period totally off Facebook, take a period totally off Twitter, and you'll find that the things that seem to you extremely important conversations, actually everyone's forgotten about them.
Yep.
Within during the period that you were off, they became important and then were immediately forgotten about again. And it can give you a better sense of perspective. and then having gotten that sense of perspective, I think it's crucial to sort of say, what are my purposes for using this medium? What is it good for? Does it actually enable me to serve my family, serve my church, serve the kingdom, and engage intentionally, be an agent.
Yeah.
Don't be just a passive billiard ball being bumped around in this medium.
And what we've been discussing so far could leave people with the impression that we should all become Luddites. I don't think that's the case. The internet has been something that's been a remarkable tool in my life. Not just a tool, but something that has enabled me to form communities and become part of communities, to connect with people, to share ideas, to learn from others.
I mean, it's the only reason that we know each other.
Exactly.
That's the only reason, and we're having this. We're
I would not be
broadcasting this conversation to a much wider audience.
I probably would not be studying theology were it not for the internet, for various reasons. And so I do not want to dismiss the internet. Rather, I want us to do it well, because there is such a great potential if it is used well. But since it's such a powerful medium and technology, it can also do a lot of ill. It can form communities that are dysfunctional, that lead to a breakdown of conversations, that lead to a distorting of our identities and the collapsing of healthy discourse. I would like to see us using the potential to build things up. And so I've discussed in the past the internet as a sort of, maybe we could see it as a sort of scaffolding. It's not a good place to live within, but it enables us to build things up that we would not have been able to build up otherwise. It allows us to repair our communities.
Right.
It allows us to develop new structures that are remarkable. There are ways in which we and other friends have developed communities out of the internet that are real world communities now, and increasingly taking concrete forms and organizations and other things like that that would not exist were it not for the scaffolding of the internet. But if the internet becomes a mere substitute for the sorts of communities that are rooted in the real world, grounded in context, that have a gravitational pull that draws us out in effective virtues, I think if we lack that, we won't be formed well by the internet. We'll end up being misled and brought into dysfunction by it. But that's not necessarily the way it must take us. There are ways in which prudentially and wisely approached, the internet can be a remarkable source of good.
Great. Thanks.